Hello everybody, Noah here with Learn Meta-Analysis. In this video we are going to talk about literature searching and database building, two of the most important pieces of the systematic review process in terms of actually getting started. So let's check out some conceptual information that we need to know to be able to do this successfully. So by the end of this video, you'll be able to create an effective search string for your review. You'll identify how to create a comprehensive literature search, and you'll also be able to set up your record keeping in a way that's going to help align with Prisma reporting standards, because it is very important that we are able to report our reviews in a way that is replicable as well as transparent, and that's what Prisma aims to do. So let's talk about the importance of your search string first, and I cannot get this point across clearly enough. Your search string underlies everything. Okay, so if your search string is bad, it doesn't matter how good your analysis is, it doesn't matter how advanced your analysis is, it doesn't matter how many variables you extract data for during the data extraction, it doesn't matter how long it takes you to screen. If your search string is bad, your whole study is flawed. Okay, so take that in for a few minutes, because I know that one of the things that tends to happen as we start to set up our systematic review is we're like, oh, we'll just come up with a search string quickly. No, I would argue that you really need to put a lot of time, energy, and thought into actually designing your search string to try and make sure it's capturing everything you want it to capture. So this is really important, not only because it underlies everything, but also because you want to try and avoid reviewers suggesting that you missed something important, right? So I don't know about you, but if you submit a review and one of the reviewers comes back and says, hey, this other keyword is really prevalent in the field, especially in this particular subdiscipline, super relevant to what you're doing, but you didn't search for it. That's a problem, right? That means you're going to have to go back and redo your search. And not many people want to spend time going back and redoing something they've already done. So it's really important that we try and think about these issues ahead of time and come up with a really strong search string. As I mentioned probably 15 times already in this video, your review is only as good as your search string. So we really need to put time into making sure that our search string is as good as it can possibly be. All right, so how do we build it? Let's look at an example, okay? Example research question. What is the impact of 360 video on learning? And this is actually a meta-analysis I did a few years ago with my colleagues. So what was the search string that we used? Well, when we started reading about 360 video, we knew that there were a number of different ways 360 video was actually written in papers. And from experimenting with running searches, we could see that they didn't all come up under the same search. So let's look at what this looked like. If we search for 360 video, that didn't necessarily find things that use the terms 360 video, or didn't necessarily find things that use the term 360-degree video, or didn't necessarily find things with the actual symbol for degrees. So we ended up including all of that in our search string, and we said that it also had to include the word learning. Now let's take a real quick walk through what some of these important points are here, because you're probably, if you're not familiar with searching databases, you're probably looking at this and thinking, wow, that's a weird way to write everything that you have there. So first and foremost, I want to talk about the asterisk that we have on the end of learning. In the databases that we searched, that means that anything coming after the letter N would be captured by that search. So if they use the word learned, would have an ED at the end of that, they would capture that. If it used the term learning with ing at the end, it would also capture that. Now let's look at the one above. So you can see that we have the parentheses first and foremost, and then inside of that we have or, and or is separating a number of words that are within quotes. So by adding the quotes, we're saying it needs to be that specific phrase, and by adding or, it says it could be different variants of that phrase. So essentially when we read this search string, what conceptually we're doing is we're saying you can spell or talk about 360 video in any of these ways that are listed here, but the study also has to have some word associated with learn. So either learns, learning, learned, etc. Those are the two main components that we needed. However, with this study, we realized a problem as we started reviewing the papers that are coming up and seeing the search string, and we realized we had made a mistake. Right? We had missed a key term, and that key term was spherical video. We found a number of studies that talked about 360 video, but they called it spherical video. So what we had to do is we had to go back and run another search using the term spherical video. And you can see here we use the asterisk at the end of sphere, so that way it would capture numerous different endings. And you can see we still have the word learning with the asterisk on the end, or I'm sorry, the word learn with the asterisk on the end, in the hopes that we will capture more. So in hindsight, this was a mistake, right? It would have been much easier to just incorporate that spherical video term somewhere into the previous search string, but we didn't know about that when we started, and so we ended up having to go back and run a separate search. So why is this problematic? Well, in some ways it isn't, right? Because we can use software to help us identify duplicate studies that came up, and then we just add these additional studies to our database. So it's not really that big of a deal. We, as long as we do proper record keeping, it's fine. It's more just an annoyance than anything else, and it's a time commitment more than anything else. Because as I mentioned, we did have to go through and remove duplicate studies from both of these databases together. So we basically added the second database to the first, and then we had to remove all those duplicates that came up again after we'd already gone through the process of removing duplicates once within the initial search. So it's really just an annoyance when you catch it yourself, and you catch it early before you're too far down through the process. Now, if this had come up later, like after we were done screening abstracts, then it would have been even more annoying, because then we'd have to essentially, we don't have to restart the whole search, but we're back to abstract screening, when at least emotionally and from a process standpoint for the other one, if we're at full text screening with one, but then we have to go back to abstract screening, that's kind of just an annoyance, right? Nobody wants to go back and do things over again. So creating a good search string the first time, really, really, really important to try and save yourself future time later, and also save future headache from later. Now, how about picking databases? Now, this is often a question I got asked by people, especially when they're just starting. It's like, how do you know what databases to pick? Well, in part, it's going to have to do with norms in your field. The other part of this is going to have to do with what you're researching. And the third part of this is what databases are actually accessible to you. So our goal should be to conduct a comprehensive search. That's what we're trying to do with a meta-analysis or a systematic review in general, is we want to try and capture everything related to what we're interested in. So my perspective on this is more is often better, but not always. And I know that's vague and not a terribly helpful comment, right? But the reason I say this is because there's so many contextual factors that we need to consider. The other piece to this is it doesn't necessarily help to have 15,000 results if only 200 of them are relevant, right? So we need to really think through what databases we're searching and what's going to be the most productive for us. So one of the ways that you can go about doing this is to first look and see what other reviewers in the field have searched. So find other systematic reviews or meta-analyses in your field, see what databases they said they searched, and start there. That is not the ending point. That is simply a starting point. The reason I mention this is because I've read a lot of systematic reviews or meta-analyses where they only read one or maybe two databases. And what I mean is they only searched one or two databases. Personally, I do not think that is enough to create a comprehensive search in many research areas, especially in my area of educational technology. We see some things being published in computer science areas, we see others in medical areas, we see other in traditional education areas. So essentially what I'm trying to say is poor methods in previous reviews do not rationalize you using poor methods. You don't want somebody else to be able to look at your paper and say something like, oh, well, I'm just going to discard this because they missed so much stuff, right? So you don't want to have that paper. So don't follow a poor example. You just want to use the other papers as a starting point. And I'm not saying all the other papers are going to be poor papers, by the way. Obviously, there's some good ones. So if you're finding a systematic review or a meta-analysis about your area, and you're like, wow, they hit all of the major databases, plus like 2 or 3 others I didn't even know about that are relevant, by all means, it makes sense to build off what they've done, right? You don't necessarily have to add more to differentiate your study. It might be that they've already searched them all, and that's very helpful for you to know. Like I said, the main reason we're looking at these existing reviews in the field is not necessarily to critique them. That's not our point right now. Our point right now is to find a starting point, to find out what's been done, what's the norm. All right, so here are some example databases from educational technology, and what I found is that different institutions might have different names for some of these databases, and they may not necessarily be identical, but they're relatively similar, at least from what I can tell, from a distance, so to speak. So Scopus is one of the big databases that you may have heard of. We also have Web of Science, which is also a database that it kind of acts like a search of a number of other databases, to my understanding. ERIC is a really popular one in education. Academic Search Complete, I've also seen I don't know if it's the exact same database, but it's a similar title of Academic Search Premier. I don't know how those two differ. We have ACM Digital Library, tends to be more computer science focused. We have IEEE Explore, which tends to be more towards the engineering side of things. We have Medline with full text, which is similar to PubMed. So these are the databases that I generally use as a starting point when I'm doing searches in educational technology. I typically don't have access to Scopus, but sometimes that is available. It just depends on what you have available to you. Okay, so next, another reason we want to look at these previous reviews is to actually look at the references that they had and the studies that they had included. So the existing review reference list provide a great source of research items. I generally pull references from every review in the area. So what I mean is this. Let's say I'm doing a systematic review or a meta-analysis on virtual characters and learning. I would then go find every study that I can that is a systematic review or a meta-analysis of virtual characters on learning, and I would make sure that I have all of the references that they list in my database. Okay, because sometimes they search things differently than I search things, and I want to make sure that it's all included. So I will go pull those references and include them in my database, and I make a note about it in my methods section that I did that. And I have some practical tools that'll help you do this later that I actually just recently learned about. So oh, I forgot I had this bullet point. Yeah, so this can be very time consuming, right? So imagine you have like 6 or 8 systematic reviews or data or meta-analyses that you need to go through and pull references from. Well, in the past, I've always done this by hand, like individually taking studies and adding them to my database, and it takes forever. I really don't enjoy doing it at all. I recently learned about a software tool that'll help you with this, and that'll be discussed in a different video. Okay, so running a good search is important, right? We need to make sure we have a good search string. We need to make sure we search all of the relevant databases, but you also need to make sure that you record everything about your search, and that way you have that information later for when you're writing up your study. So you'll need this to report in essentially the Prisma style reporting standards. So here's some key items that I make sure I record. I'm not saying this is an all-encompassing list because my preference is to record everything. These are just some key things to remember. The exact date of your literature search, the databases you searched, the exact search string used for each database, including any filters you might have used, the number of items located in each database. Okay, so why are we doing this? The key is that we want to make sure whatever we do is replicable and transparent. Right? We want to make sure that somebody else who picks up our study can go run the same search and expect to find reasonably the same results on their own. Okay, so one final thing that comes up, and I'm going to just touch on it now, we'll talk about it more later in a different video, is how many studies is too many studies. So let's say you're trying to set up your search string and you end up with 15,000 studies. I would argue that's probably too much, but it really depends on your research area. So some research areas are very new and are only going to have a few studies. Other research areas are really well established, and you can reasonably expect to find 400 or 500 studies that are going to meet your inclusion criteria. So when we go through the practical example of setting up a search string, I'll walk you through some of this thought process as you set it up. But generally speaking, for somebody new to systematic reviews and meta-analysis, assuming they're not working in an area or with research questions that are like super broad, then I try and aim for studies to have between 1,000 and 1,500 abstracts to start with. The reason is that, number one, you can get through those in a reasonable amount of time. Number two, you can usually, it all depends on your search string and your inclusion criteria, etc. But you can usually end up with appropriate number of studies to be able to run your meta-analysis or be able to have a really meaningful systematic review from that point. So generally speaking, I like to have 1,000 to 1,500 studies, especially for new reviewers to this process. If you only have like 300, number one, depending upon the field, I question if your search string was broad enough. Number two, you run the risk of not actually having enough to do a really particularly meaningful analysis, which can make it really challenging to publish. So there's a lot of contextual factors that come into play there, and we'll talk about it more in a future video. So that summarizes some of the conceptual things we need to think about with our literature search. I hope you found this helpful, and I will see you guys in the next video.